Hey friends, welcome back. This is Brad Wetzler, and this is the Enlightened-ish podcast. Today I want to tell a story, and I don't want to do too much setup except to say that this story is about a lot of things. But primarily, I think it's about faith. And so I'll let the story speak for itself. Several years ago, I traveled to southern India for a pilgrimage to Arunachala, a conical mountain considered by Hindus to be the embodiment of Shiva, the god of destruction and rebirth. At the time, I was reeling from a romantic breakup and still processing a mind-blowing experience that happened to me while traveling in northern India several months earlier. The words mystical, numinous, unitive, and the Sanskrit word samadhi, they all describe that experience. And they are all woefully inadequate too. I gravitate more toward acid trippy, spiritually orgasmic, and seeing behind the curtain and witnessing the sheer of ultimate reality. If you've had that type of experience, and I've had a few, you know that integrating experiences like this can take months, sometimes years. And people wiser than me, people familiar with these things, will tell you that you've got to be careful with what you do in your mind with the memories of these experiences. They can be so far out, so disruptive, and so potentially magical, meaningful, healing, revealing, what have you, that your ego just might try to bully you into downplaying it or suppressing it. Your ego might want to make sure that you never have one again. But I'm not an expert in ego psychology or what might be called spiritual development. I'm here as a traveler and a storyteller. So let me just get back to the story. My friends and I arrived at Tiruvannamalai, a historic spiritual center at the base of the mountain, and we made our way to the famous Ramana Maharshi ashram, where the namesake 20th century yogi, Ramana Maharshi, had lived and taught. We entered the ashram grounds and filled our water bottles, and then, barefoot, we hiked along the rocky trails up the flank of the great mountain. My feet were killing me from frostbite I'd suffered a few weeks earlier while hiking back in Colorado. And since my arrival in India, several of my toes had turned bright red and then black. I visited a doctor who told me that I had severe frostbite and I might end up losing the ends of my toes. He prescribed antibiotics to prevent further infection. But suffice it to say, I was in a lot of physical pain. And as I climbed the mountain barefoot on these rocks, the uneven trail caused my toes to throb. But the physical pain paled maybe in comparison to the mental struggle I'd been locked in all winter. Looking back, I was at a fulcrum point in my life. I was fed up with myself. I was fed up with many of my old patterns, ways of thinking, feeling, and being. I was fed up with seeking. I was fed up with reading self-help books. I had not had a sustained relationship with a woman since my 15-year marriage ended about 10 years earlier. I was also still several months away from receiving a medical diagnosis of PTSD that would change how I viewed my life and would change how I would view my healing path. It would help me to eventually come to terms with the internal suffering that had afflicted me since my teen years, and which was the cause of my struggles with shame, depression, loneliness, which had kept me isolated, and it kept me from having a good relationship with both myself and other people for quite a long time. I was desperate at this time when I was in India to understand why I had spent so much time seeking the wisdom of experts in psychology and spirituality. And I was, as I said, just fed up with all of it, all the seeking. Something had to give, and I was hoping that this trip to India this time would lead to that giving way, to that something giving in my life that would bring more clarity and more peace and ease. As I climbed the mountainside barefoot toward the caves where Ramana Maharshi had spent many years meditating and actually having his legs gnawed on by scorpions and spiders, I cringed at each step. I kept walking, though, and I heard something rustling in the forest off to my left. I turned and peered through the trees, and there, about 20 feet away from me, was a tall, thin monkey. I identified it as a Hanuman monkey. Langur is the other name for a Hanuman monkey. They are abundant in the north of India, in the Himalayan foothills. And in fact, on a previous trip up there, I'd had a bizarre encounter with one in which this monkey and I had made eye contact for an extended period of time. Hanuman monkeys were less abundant in the south, where it's much hotter and there's less mountainous territory. But they were sometimes seen on Arunachal, I'd read. This particular Hanuman monkey appeared to be old and was emaciated, maybe sick. He was trudging up the mountain on a parallel path to mine. I stopped and watched it, and then resumed my ascent. This monkey and I seemed to walk together for the next 5 or 10 minutes. Our gaits similar even. And then the monkey veered off and disappeared into the forest. I kept walking, and after about 15 more minutes, I arrived at the first set of caves. I set my bag down outside and entered one of them. Inside, it was dark and very hot. I suspect it was maybe 120 degrees. I sat cross-legged on a ledge and began to meditate to the mantra Om Namashivaya. Up in the Himalayas the previous fall, a 100-year-old yogi whom I'd met with in a cave there had told me to chant Om Namashivaya every day. He'd said that chanting these words would bring me more ease and less mental suffering. I'd been faithfully following his advice, chanting Om Namah Shivaya for several meditation periods a day, maybe up to an hour or more. With the cave's intense heat and darkness, it wasn't hard to fall into a deep meditative trance. And I did. And then some other seekers entered the cave, and their rustling of packs and whispers broke my trance. And my mind began to wander. And I thought about the monkey I'd encountered on the hike up. Was he old, sick? What was happening for this monkey? I'm somebody who thinks in symbols. I'm hyper aware of things, messages, synchronicities that show up in my life. Not in a woo-woo way. I'm not the type that says, oh, that was a symbol definitely of this. Nor would I say that was somebody who'd come back to life to give me a message. Not like that. It's more like I'm a believer in what Carl Jung's descriptions of synchronicity, that we humans do not totally grasp how bizarre and expansive our consciousness really is, and how connected our minds are with others' minds and the entire field of consciousness, perhaps. I don't see things like this monkey appearing in my life as pure coincidence. I see it as time to take note. For instance, a few weeks ago, here in Austin, Texas, where I live, a sick cat showed up at my girlfriend's house. Before we could figure out what to do about it, this cat crawled under the deck and died. We couldn't reach it. The next day, 2 vultures appeared at the deck and pecked frustratingly at the wood before eventually giving up and realizing they couldn't get to it either. The stink increased over the next week or two. It became unbearable to sit on the deck. 2 weeks later, a man was murdered in the parking lot of my apartment complex. For real. That's a lot of death in my field of consciousness, I might say. And so I asked, what does all this mean? I knew I couldn't comprehend it. I knew there was no certain answer to it. I didn't take it to mean that I would die next or anything like that, but rather that there was a lot of endings happening in my life, perhaps. And maybe there were a lot of new beginnings around the corner, too. And so back in India that day, I was climbing Arunachala. I knew that this monkey, a Hanuman monkey, was in my field for some reason that I couldn't totally comprehend, but I did know it meant something. Hanuman, by the way, is a Hindu god that functions in similar to Jesus. Hanuman was a monkey god, and he served this Ram, his master, always before himself. And he was quoted as saying that when he forgets how powerful he is, when Hanuman forgets how powerful he is, he serves his master God. And when he remembers, he knows that he is God. That's us. In India, we humans are at root a soul, an Atman. And through our Atman, we are connected to all, to everyone. I'm butchering this. I'm not an expert in Hinduism, but you get the picture. I was being followed up the mountain by a Hanuman monkey. I ended up leaving that cave and entering a second cave where I meditated more. And then I left that cave and walked further up the mountain to a new set of caves where I entered them. Eventually, I returned to the ashram, limping on my frostbitten feet. There, I said goodbye to my friends. I wanted to spend the night before our pilgrimage day alone. I hired an auto rickshaw to take me to a bamboo hut on a farm outside of the city, which was in sight of Arunachala. I just couldn't be with the others on this night. I needed to be alone. And there, in my bamboo hut and on the front porch of it, I spent the day meditating and practicing yoga and writing in my journal. Occasionally, I stared off into the distance at Arunachala, wrapped in clouds. The sun went down and a full moon rose in the sky. I dropped onto the mattress in my bamboo hut, hoping for a peaceful rest. I fell asleep listening to mosquitoes bombard the window screens. The peace didn't last. 2 hours later, I was awake, staring at the wood rafters. When it became clear I wasn't going to go back to sleep, I got up and I went outside to the bamboo balcony and spread out my yoga mat. I moved through a few yoga poses in the dark. Moving my body like this clears energy trapped in muscle and sinew. It makes me feel better and sometimes allows me to go back to sleep. But on this night, sleep wasn't in the cards. After more yoga poses, I lay on my mat, lost in thought, staring across the grassy land at Arunachala, the Shiva mountain. Clouds shrouded its conical summit, and lit by a full moon, the mountain seemed to glow from the inside. I sat upright and stared. It was an odd sight, this inner glow. I recalled the beginning 7 years earlier of my midlife spiritual quest. The catalyst, putting the body of my friend Paul in a body bag. Paul had overdosed on opiates. When we arrived at his house, he was lifeless and blue on the floor of a hallway. After the coroner completed his investigation and declared a suicide, The coroner held up an orange body bag and asked if I'd help him perform the grim task of putting Paul in it and carrying him to the hearse. What could I say? With tears in my eyes, I agreed. I remembered a meeting with Paul a few weeks earlier. Paul had suffered from depression too, and he'd been taking a lot of meds. He looked at me and said, "These drugs killed my spirit, Brad. Why not kill the body too?" I knew what he intended to do, and I didn't have a good answer for him. And I feel ashamed of that to this day. A few months later, my eyes still feel tear-filled. I hit the road for Israel and Palestine to walk in the footsteps of Jesus, my childhood hero. I couldn't name or label it, but I knew I'd reached the end of one life phase and I was beginning another. After years of living as an agnostic, I wanted to see if I could believe in God again, and I hoped walking where Jesus walked might ignite my faith. I spent several months in Israel and Palestine. It didn't work. I came back still a seeker, but I did have amazing adventures in the Holy Land, and the trip did change me. When I returned home, I went inward and I began journaling each morning when I woke. I committed to daily yoga. I traveled to sacred sites in the US and abroad. Sacred sites seemed to help me feel sacred too. I didn't know then that these feelings were inside me and I could access them without the sacred sites. That would be a lesson I'd later learn. But that night in India, alone on the balcony, staring off at the mountain, I realized that I'd been seeking wholeness in the form of the divine most of my life. What was driving this seeking, I wondered? What was underneath this lifelong questing? And then I had a bizarre idea. I decided to say a prayer to Shiva. Now, I'm not a Hindu, and praying was not my thing at that time. But in this moment, it felt right. I felt called from the inside to talk with the god of destruction and rebirth. Anyway, I think of the Hindu gods as being representative of different parts of us, energies that exist in all of us. Our Shiva energy is the part of us that knows and sees all of us. Pure awareness, pure consciousness. Shiva energy is wildly unpredictable, though, too. Shiva energy is capable of transforming us from the bottom up. On this sleepless night, Shiva was definitely the right guy. In this prayer, I asked Shiva to shatter me, obliterate me, change me. I guess I was asking myself to shatter me. I don't know. Or the universe or something. Well, whoever the hell does the shattering and obliterating around here. Just do it, I said, maybe even out loud. When I was finished talking to Shiva, I lay back on my yoga mat. I felt too fried to move. Wasn't it odd, I thought, that I was on the spiritual adventure of a lifetime? That all my seeking had led me to this moment, to this pilgrimage on the Shiva mountain? But I wasn't feeling it. I was exhausted. I was dead tired of seeking. Maybe the best thing I can do is stop all this seeking now, I thought. I considered retreating under the covers and sleeping through the pilgrimage. I came damn close, but I didn't. I sat up and stared out at the Tamil countryside. It clicked for me why I was here and why I had been a lifelong seeker. Yes, I was seeking God in some way. Yes, I was seeking spiritual connection and healing. But I was also increasingly aware that I was seeking some things even more elusive than God. I was seeking to heal my confusing, painful past. I'd left my childhood home in Kansas at age 18 and headed east to study at the University of Virginia. But I never settled into a comfortable college life. The depressions that had haunted me from age 13 or 14 increased in intensity and frequency. I had no tools to know what to do with these feelings of hopelessness. I spent a lot of time lying on my bed or walking the trails in the Blue Ridge Mountains, chewing on life's big questions, as if finding the answers to these questions could somehow make me feel better. I didn't know it then, but I was living with trauma. I'll spare you the details of how and why for now, but my childhood had been hard and unhappy, and I had disconnected from myself. At least that's what the doctors would tell me at age 50, decades later. Of course, we all carry burdens. And as a privileged white man, I'm aware that my burdens can pale in comparison to others. But I'm also aware that we all suffer as part of being a human. We are sensitive animals, not really built for the modern world that we've created for ourselves. On that night, now an early morning in India, I was at wit's end. I wasn't suicidal, but I also was without a plan for what I'd do if I wasn't soon transformed and found more peace of mind. Could I even go on with it? I preferred not to think about it. I asked Arunachala, Shiva, to show me a path forward. More than that, I wanted Shiva to show me a deeper truth. And the truth is, looking back, that night on the mountain, I was already moving into a better place. I just didn't see it yet. For several years, I'd been meditating and practicing yoga enthusiastically. I didn't know how or why, but all the work I'd been doing was showing me glimpses of my deeper self, my truer self. My true self was emerging slowly, but it was happening. Even so, I'm an impatient sort. And that night, I wanted Shiva to shatter me so that I could rebuild myself from the bottom up now. I wanted to know what love was. As I lay on my yoga mat outside my hut, I remembered what a spiritual teacher had told me at a workshop I'd attended. Meditation and yoga can lead one to more faith, and not just blind faith, but living faith. Not belief, not an idea, but a deep knowing, a deeper trust in ourselves, and maybe the universe too. Life can get better when we are in hard places. That night, I asked Shiva to obliterate me in order to rebuild myself from the ground up with faith, maybe with some self-love too. The full moon was fat and bright. My eyes landed on Arunachala across the valley. The summit was socked in by clouds. I thought of all the names for Shiva, the supreme god, the Lord of lords, the yogi of all yogis, the Adi yogi, the god of destruction and transformation. This was why my prayer had been to Shiva, asking Shiva to lay me bare and show me exactly who I was. I must have drifted back to sleep because the rickshaw driver's horn surprised me awake. Excited, anxious, sad, angry, and at the same time filled with more gratitude for this life journey than seemed possible. I gathered my day pack and water bottle and descended the ladder to the dirt. I nodded hello to the rickshaw driver. Climbing into the back seat, we bounced down the dirt road to a paved highway that led us into downtown Tiruvannamalai and the gathering site for our pilgrimage. I reconvened with my group, who'd stayed at a retreat center. Together we began our walk, each of us silently chanting the mantra Om Namashivaya. I bow to the Lord Shiva. The first 2 miles of the pilgrimage route took us through downtown Tiruvannamalai. Then we left the sidewalk for a single-track trail through brushy landscape. I tried to stay centered on the mantra. It felt both monotonous and invigorating. I understood why mantras are believed to be powerful tools. According to the yoga texts, chanting a god's name silently invokes the energy of that god. Every few minutes, I took my eyes off the path in front of me and looked up at Arunachala's cloud-wrapped summit. I'll never forget that image. The cloud didn't appear like a typical mountain rain cloud. It had a brown tint and it swirled. It looked like a cloud of electrons. I fantasized that Shiva was in that flurry of energy, ready to magically take away my pain on this mountain. I was on the pilgrimage of a lifetime, headed somewhere outside of myself. But I seemed to finally understand something that escaped me in all my previous seeking. Why had I spent so much energy and time seeking answers out in the world? What was so bad about Brad? My mind left the path and traveled back in time to my teenage years when I first began to be visited by long, severe depressions that came and went without warning. It was obvious why I had been running my whole life. I had blamed myself for certain events of my youth. I'd felt shame and a lot of inner turmoil. There's nothing like the feeling of depression to make you not want to be yourself. I kept walking. I kept chanting. The final 2 miles of the path was on city streets. It was now daylight. Traffic was heavy. It was hard to stay with my Om Namashivaya as I dodged cars, rickshaws, and bikes. My mind stopped reminiscing and landed suddenly on surviving Indian rush hour. I was approaching Ramana Maharshi ashram again, the end of the walk. And then there I was, standing underneath the ashram sign. I found a quiet, grassy spot under a tree, and a swell of emotion rose inside of me. Too many to discern one from another: joy, sorrow, anger, and even every emotion in between. I curled into a ball and just cried. I'd never cried so hard. The emotions behind the tears were complex. I could feel below the surface a deep sadness at the great lengths I'd gone to seek answers, to seek healing. Decades of seeking. I was crying over the human condition, not really just my life. We are all driven to such lengths to run from pain. There was also a tinge of resolved happiness. I could feel it. I finally understood some things, and for the first time, I was actually finding what I'd been seeking all along: me. And if Eastern wisdom is correct, when you discover your true self, you also discover the divine. For as Hanuman said, the self and God are one and the same. The tears told me I was getting closer to pay dirt. Shiva had done what I'd asked. I was obliterated. At the bottom of the obliteration, though, was a kind of peace. There was no reason to run anymore. There was no flawed person to fix. No bad Brad to run away from. There was no better Brad to achieve. Underneath the sorrow, there was a bigger sense of self that I could access. So something changed in me that day on Arunachala. I glimpsed something I had never seen before, at least not since I was very, very young. It was only a glimpse, and so I can't say for certain what I saw. But during and after my circumambulation of Arunachala, I peered deeper inside myself than I had done before. Deeper than during the most focused yoga or meditation session. Deeper than during any adventure to a far-flung natural place. Deeper than during the most reverent, prayerful visit to a sacred site or Indian temple. Arunachala shattered me, opened me, and through the tears I glimpsed something bright, essential, and true. I don't know what to call it. My soul. Maybe. Do I believe in a soul? Thank you for listening to the story today. I'll just let it sit. Let you make sense of it. And I'll end with this chant. May all beings be happy and free, and may the thoughts, words, and actions of my own life contribute in some way to that happiness and freedom for all. I hope you'll visit my website. I have information there about my writing courses, coaching, online yoga, and of course, this Enlightened-ish podcast. I'll see you next time on Enlightened-ish.